They say a man's legacy is written in the things he leaves behind, but for Rick Harrison, the most painful chapter wasn't found in a pawn shop ledger or a dusty antique. It was written in a courtroom. For years, the face of Pawn Stars navigated the highs of global fame while silently carrying a weight no father is prepared for. We often see the curated version of a life, the deals, the laughs, and the treasures, but what happens when the one thing you can't negotiate for is your own child's freedom? Today, we step behind the gold and silver to uncover a story of family, consequence, and the quiet reality of a father who finally had to face a truth that no amount of money could change. To the world, Rick Harrison is the ultimate pragmatist. Standing behind the counter of the world-famous gold and silver pawn shop, he is the man who knows the value of everything and the price of nothing. By the age of 59, Rick had successfully transformed a small family business into a global empire, becoming a household name synonymous with history, sharp wit, and the art of the deal. But beneath the polished surface of a reality TV star lies a man whose early life was defined by a desperate need for stability. Growing up under the watchful, often stern eye of the old man, Richard Benjamin Harrison, Rick learned early on that life is a series of transactions. He saw his father build a legacy from the ground up, and Rick aimed to do the same for his own sons. His motivation was simple: provide a foundation so strong that his children would never have to struggle as he did. In his mind, success was a shield. If he could build a large enough empire, he could protect his family from the unpredictable hardships of the world. However, psychological experts often note that high-achieving patriarchs can unknowingly create a shadow so large that their children struggle to find their own light. For the Harrison family, the pawn shop wasn't just a business, it was the center of their solar system. While the cameras captured the camaraderie and the light-hearted bickering that viewers loved, the internal world of the family was becoming increasingly complex. Rick was a man who prided himself on being able to spot a fake from a mile away, yet in his own home, the most significant challenges were beginning to hide in plain sight. The emotional stakes were quietly rising. Rick had built a fortress of gold and silver, but he was beginning to realize that wealth is a poor defense against the internal demons of those you love most. He was a father who believed that as long as the business was thriving, the family was safe. It was a comforting thought, one that allowed him to focus on the next big acquisition while the foundations of his personal life began to shift. But while the world watched the Harrisons trade for pieces of history, a different kind of history was being written in the dark, one that started with a phone call Rick never expected to receive, changing the value of his legacy forever. In the world of the Harrisons, fame was a family trade. Corey and Austin became familiar faces to millions, but then there was Adam. Adam Harrison was the son who chose a different rhythm. While his brothers embraced the spotlight and the unique pressures of reality TV stardom, Adam stepped back. He chose a path of privacy, working in the shop in the early days but eventually moving away from the cameras to pursue his own interests, including plumbing. From a psychological perspective, being the invisible son in a world-famous family creates a unique set of pressures. There is the weight of the family name without the public platform to define oneself. For Adam, the desire for a normal life may have been a search for an identity that wasn't tied to a television script or a high-stakes negotiation. Yet, even in the shadows, the Harrison tag followed him. Rick, as a father, respected this choice, perhaps even finding comfort in the idea that at least one of his children was safe from the voyeuristic gaze of the public. However, the cracks began to form in the quietest moments. The distance between Adam's private world and the family's public empire grew wider. In many families, these small shifts are overlooked, dismissed as a young man finding his way. But for Rick, the realization that his son was drifting into a different kind of darkness was a slow, agonizing process. He was used to being the man with all the answers, the man who could tell you exactly what a 19th-century sword was worth, but he found himself increasingly unable to read the emotions of his own child. The turning point came when the family's private struggle could no longer be contained within the walls of their home. It is a devastating moment for any parent when they realize that the stability they worked decades to build isn't a cure for a child's internal pain. Rick was forced to watch as Adam's path diverged from the one he had envisioned. The emotional impact was profound. The old man's son was now a father himself, facing the terrifying reality that he might lose a son to the very world he tried to protect him from. The psychological tension between the public persona of the cool, collected boss and the private reality of a worried father began to tear at the seams. As the distance between father and son grew, a single night of poor choices would lead to a legal battle that threatened to dismantle the Harrison name and leave Rick facing a reality that no deal could ever fix. When the legal system becomes involved in a family matter, the world changes. For Rick Harrison, a man who navigated the complex regulations of the pawn industry for decades, the law was usually something to be managed or followed to ensure business success. But when the law turned its gaze toward his son, it felt different. It was no longer about permits or licenses, it was about human life and the cold, hard reality of consequence. The investigation into Adam's situation brought a different kind of pressure to the Harrison household. The media, always hungry for a story that punctures the veil of celebrity perfection, began to circle. Rick found himself in a psychological vice. On one side was his duty to his brand and his employees, the need to keep the Pawn Stars machine running, and on the other was the raw, primal instinct to protect his child. He was forced to process mounting evidence and legal jargon that painted a picture of a son he barely recognized. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was one of hushed conversations and heavy silences. Rick spent hours in consultations with legal experts, looking for a way out, a way to mitigate the damage, or a way to understand how things had gone so far wrong. This is the moment where the fixer mentality of a successful businessman meets its greatest challenge. In a pawn deal, if you don't like the terms, you walk away. In a courtroom, there is no walking away. You are at the mercy of a system that is designed to be objective, unyielding, and often, unforgiving. The psychological toll was visible to those close to him. The quick wit was replaced by long periods of reflection. Rick was experiencing the limits of his own influence. He could buy almost any historical artifact in the world, but he couldn't buy a different outcome for his son. The realization that a life sentence, whether literal or figurative in the sense of a permanent legal stain, was looming over his family was a weight that grew heavier with every passing court date. He was a man accustomed to winning, now facing the ultimate loss. The emotional stakes had moved beyond the shop and into the realm of permanent, life-altering tragedy. With the gavel ready to fall and the rumors reaching a fever pitch, Rick had to make a choice. Would he continue to fight a losing battle in the court of public opinion, or would he finally speak the truth about his son's fate? There is a specific kind of courage required to speak a painful truth when you know the entire world is listening. For Rick Harrison, that moment came when he decided to stop the cycle of rumors and address the reality of his son's situation. At 59, a time when many are looking toward retirement and legacy building, Rick stood before the public not as a television star, but as a grieving father. The confirmation of the life sentence rumors was handled with a level of emotional intelligence that surprised many. Rick didn't lean into anger or blame the system, instead, he spoke from a place of profound sorrow and acceptance. Psychologically, this transition is significant. It marks the move from denial to a stage of mourning. By confirming the truth, Rick stripped away the power of the secret. He allowed the public to see the raw reality of his pain, breaking the documentary-style perfection of his public life. In his statements, Rick emphasized the tragedy of addiction and the permanent consequences of a single, devastating path. He focused on the psychological evolution of his own perspective, acknowledging that while he was a man of gold and silver, the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be put in a display case. The tone was calm and reflective, a stark contrast to the high-energy deals seen on television. It was the sound of a man who had finally stopped negotiating with reality. The audience, used to seeing Rick in total control, was suddenly confronted with his vulnerability. This moment of revelation served as a psychological mirror for many viewers, reminding them that fame and fortune do not provide an exit ramp from the human experience. Rick's confirmation wasn't just a news update, it was a profound reflection on the nature of family, the limits of fatherhood, and the heavy price of truth. The emotional journey reached its climax here, as the patriarch of the Harrison family stood in the debris of a shattered dream and chose to be honest about the cost. But confirming the truth was only the beginning of a much longer journey. Now, Rick had to figure out how to walk back into the pawn shop and keep living under the weight of that truth. The aftermath of a public tragedy often leaves a family in a state of ambiguous loss. This psychological term describes the grief felt when a loved one is still alive but is no longer accessible, lost to the legal system, to addiction, or to a life that can no longer be shared. For the Harrisons, the confirmation of Adam's fate created a new, quieter kind of tension within their home. The family business, once a source of pride and unity, now stood as a constant reminder of what was missing. Rick's other children, Corey and Austin, had to navigate their own grief while remaining in the public eye. The dynamic of the family shifted from a focus on growth and expansion to a focus on endurance. They had to learn how to support their father while processing their own feelings of loss and perhaps even guilt. In a house that had always been defined by the old man's strength, the new reality required a different kind of fortitude, the ability to sit with pain without trying to fix it. Rick, as the patriarch, faced the monumental task of keeping the family unit together. He had to be the anchor while the waves of public scrutiny and private sorrow threatened to pull them apart. Psychologically, this is a period of intense reevaluation. Every holiday, every family dinner, and every success in the shop was now tinged with the shadow of the son who wasn't there. The family had to redefine what it meant to be a Harrison. Was their identity tied only to the gold and silver, or was it found in how they carried each other through the dark? The business continued, as it must, but the energy had changed. The bickering on screen felt a little heavier, the laughs were a little more precious. Rick was learning that a house divided by tragedy doesn't necessarily fall, but it certainly feels different to live in. He was forced to balance his role as a public figure with the private necessity of healing. The world was watching for a sign of weakness, a sign that the Harrison empire was crumbling, but instead, they saw a family learning the difficult art of carrying on. Even as the pawn shop doors stayed open and the deals continued, a new and unsettling question emerged: could the Pawn Stars brand survive a tragedy that felt so permanent? To understand the Harrison story, one must look at the unique psychological ecosystem of reality television. For over a decade, the family lived in a world where every triumph and every trivial argument was curated for an audience of millions. This hustle culture, where constant growth and entertainment are the primary goals, creates a specific kind of pressure on the children involved. They grow up in a world where their value is often tied to their performance on screen and their contribution to the family brand. The question that often arises in the wake of such tragedies is, what was the human cost? While wealth provides access to the best resources, it can also create a gilded cage. For a young man like Adam, who chose to step away from the cameras, the pressure may have been even more acute. He was a part of the legacy but not the narrative. Psychologically, this can lead to a sense of isolation, being surrounded by success but feeling like a failure in comparison. Rick, reflecting on his 59 years, had to face the possibility that the very empire he built to protect his family had contributed to its struggles. It is a bitter pill for any parent to swallow. The drive to succeed, to build, and to conquer can sometimes blind a patriarch to the emotional needs of those closest to him. We see this often in high-achieving families. The material success is vast, but the emotional foundation is brittle. Rick was forced to analyze the cost of his fame in a way he never had to analyze a piece of jewelry. This chapter of his life serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of material wealth. It challenges the common belief that money is a safety net for all of life's problems. In reality, fame can act as an accelerant for existing issues, making private struggles public and turning personal pain into entertainment. Rick's journey reflects a broader human truth, that the most significant challenges we face aren't the ones we can negotiate our way out of, but the ones we must simply endure. As he looked around his shop, filled with the treasures of history, he was beginning to see that the most valuable lessons aren't found in books, but in the scars we carry. As Rick looks back on his life's work, he begins to see his greatest deals in a startlingly different light, leading to a final appraisal of what truly matters. As Rick Harrison approaches the later chapters of his life, he finds himself in a position of quiet reflection. The man who spent decades appraising the value of objects has finally turned that analytical eye inward. The confirmation of his son's fate wasn't just a legal endpoint, it was the beginning of a new way of existing in the world. He has reached a resolution that is not found in a courtroom, but in the heart of a father who has learned to accept what he cannot change. The life sentence is a term that now carries a double meaning for Rick. It is the reality his son must live, but it is also the lifelong commitment Rick has made to carry the memory and the pain of that loss with grace. Psychologically, Rick has undergone a transformation from a man of action to a man of reflection. He still runs the shop, he still makes the deals, but there is a depth to his gaze that wasn't there before. He has learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were, it's about becoming someone new through the fire. In this final appraisal, Rick acknowledges that his greatest legacy isn't the television show or the famous pawn shop. It is the honesty with which he has faced his family's darkest hour. He has shown his audience that it is okay to be broken, and it is okay to mourn the things that can never be fixed. The emotional journey concludes with a message of heavy but hopeful realism. He continues his work, but he does so with the understanding that every person who walks into his shop is carrying a history of their own, some of it gold, and some of it lead. The script ends on a thoughtful note, encouraging the viewer to look beyond the surface of the Pawn Stars persona. It asks us to consider the human beings behind the artifacts and the stories they don't always tell. Rick Harrison's journey reminds us that life is a series of trades, and sometimes, we have to trade our illusions of control for the hard, beautiful reality of the truth. While some things can never be bought back or cleaned up like a vintage car, they can be honored. As the cameras continue to roll and the neon lights of Las Vegas flicker in the background, Rick remains a man who knows the value of a story. And this story, of a father, a son, and a truth that changed everything, might just be the most important one he's ever told. In the end, we are all left to ask ourselves, when all the deals are done and the shop is closed, what is the truly most valuable thing a man can own? Perhaps it is simply the peace that comes from finally facing the truth.